When I purchased my 2022 Tiffin Midas 24RT in January of this year, that's 2023, there were 5 serious, let's call them design issues with it. Now in this video, I'm not going to go into the details of how it could have been inspected better or why it moved ahead with ownership or who's responsible or irresponsible or hey, maybe this was a first year production issue, prototype. Instead, let's just talk about the issues, how they're resolved. Now, I purchased this, the problems were identified, the dealer missed it in his pre-inspection, but they came up through more thorough inspections after staying in the RV for a night or so. But the dealer really struggled to resolve these issues, and the best solution ended up being, unfortunately, that I was going to have to take this to Tiffin's service facility in Winfield, Alabama. Well, I ended up being the first Midas that they saw in that service facility. But while I was there, you know, Tiffin's reputation precedes them in taking care of customers and making sure you're happy. I mean, they've been over backwards going through that coach, fixing my issues, fixing other issues, identifying things I hadn't thought about or found. They just made it a tremendous experience that, unfortunately, we don't see from dealers. So I was also told by Tiffin that even though I was the first one there, I guess I'm the sacrifice that they're applying the lessons learned to other Midases that they're hearing from in the fields. So maybe my lessons learned is going to benefit all of us. Okay, let's get started. Issue 1, a typical motorhome will have the vehicle's alternator charge the house batteries when the engine's running. In my case, the connection that Tiffin had made between the Ford chassis and the motorhome's house batteries was not correct. Let's start with the basics. A properly optioned Ford Transit has 2 customer connection electrical ports, which are located below the driver's seat on the left side behind a plastic cover, about 4 inches by 2 inches. I learned that the lower of these 2 connections is a 60 amp, always live 12 volt connection, and the upper connection is a 175 amp rated connection, but that's only live when the engine ignition is on. In my case, a heavy gauge cable was run from the 60 amp connection to the house batteries. Well, now since flooded batteries can take a maximum of 25 to 30 amps, you would think everything would be okay, but hey, I've got 2 batteries. What if both of these are low in voltage? Well, when the engine starts and electricity starts flowing to the house batteries, I could quickly exceed that 60 amp rating and blow a fuse. And this fuse is located in a very difficult position underneath the driver's seat. So, you know, I'm not sure how you tell if your vehicle is charging your house batteries unless you start pulling out wiring diagrams and use a voltmeter. So it's really not, to me, not readily apparent. But in my case, it became evident because the electric steps would quit functioning. They either wouldn't go out, or if they were out, they wouldn't go back in. The dealer kept saying, well, it's this 60 amp circuit. It keeps blowing this fuse. Well, I think the reason was my batteries were trying to get charged and it was blowing that circuit. So I'm not sure exactly how this resolved, other than working with Ford, Tiffin made some different connections to solve the problem. And it hadn't been a problem since. So issue number 2 was the motorhome was not connected to the correct contact in the Ford electrical system, indicating that the engine ignition was on. So in theory, the motorhome needs some logic to know if the vehicle's engine is running. If the engine's running, it says, hey, I better retract these steps. It says to the 3-way refrigerator, oh, we have all this spare electricity. Well, let's switch over. Instead of using propane, we can use the 12 volt batteries for the refrigeration process. The 3rd way it needs this ignition signal is we only want to connect the chassis batteries to the house batteries when the vehicle is running. That way we're not discharging our chassis batteries to our house batteries. And 4, the ignition, if it's on, it needs to prevent the operation of the auto leveling system. In my case, the connection that had been selected was one that stayed on for an hour after the engine was turned off. I mean, assume this is one of these connections they use for, you know, your radio operation when you turn off the vehicle, or interior lights stay on for a certain period. This wasn't going to work. Again, Tiffin found out where they needed to connect, and they revised the wiring, and that solved my problem. So now with the ignition off, everything works like it's supposed to. Issue number 3. The furnace would stop operating after about 2 hours. I got to experience this firsthand by spending 2 nights in the motorhome at an RV park adjacent to the dealer in 18-degree weather. The dealer had obviously become aware of some sort of furnace problem prior to my arrival, and they had modified the hot air ductwork and thought they'd solved the problem. Well, I'm assuming that the furnace was immediately tripping on them, but for me it was a delayed trip. So this just became another item to be added to Tiffin's list. My suspicion was that there was no dedicated return air register, so the furnace was tripping on low airflow or high temperature. To get the furnace to restart required turning it off at the thermostat and then turning it back on. My temporary fix until I made it to Tiffin was to remove a cabinet drawer adjacent to the furnace to allow free-flowing return air. Now, I'm not sure why, but Tiffin ended up replacing the furnace with what they were currently installing other Midases and adding a dedicated return air register to solve this problem. Issue number 4. The Tiffin, what they call Spider multiplex panel, was reading incorrect tank levels, and there were several touchpad switches for lights that didn't even exist. Well, the dealer had no clue, but the problem was that the software for Tiffin's Mercedes Sprinter-based Wayfarer was loaded into this panel rather than for the Midas model. Part of the problem was that the Wayfarer has tank levels measured in quarters, while the Midas only has thirds, so the level sensor signals did not align with the graphics. The problem was solved after Tiffin loaded the correct software into the multiplex system. And finally, issue number 5. The freshwater tank volume seems significantly less than specified. Now, besides the confusion in tank levels associated with the previous issue with the multiplex, when I added measured amounts of water to the freshwater tank, I could only put in about 20 gallons rather than the 30 gallons listed in their brochures. Hey, what the heck? The freshwater tank can be filled in one of 3 ways, with the primary one way being through the fill port on the driver's side. And this fill port has a vent also. Now, Tiffin worked on this problem for a while, and I was told that the redundant vent line off the passenger side of the tank, so that's on the other side of the vehicle, was not at the high point. And what it was doing, it was positioned so that it left an air gap in the top of the tank, and it wasn't usable space for water. And so the tank would fill up to this vent line and start pouring out, and it would never rise to the very top of the tank. So what they did was they raised that line so that water would reach the top of the tank. Well, upon my follow-up inspection, I started taking things apart and looking at it. I concluded when I did my test, you know what? Maybe I didn't have the tank completely drained, because the drain line was not at the best possible low point, and its routing was slightly elevated. Now maybe this is a design flaw in all freshwater tanks. For whatever reason, perhaps freeze protection, there are no connections off of the bottom of the tank. The pump suction connection seems to be lower than the low point drain. So even after routing opening low point drain on the tank, the pump was still able to remove several gallons. My fix will be to reroute the low point drain piping so that it stays as low as possible. And I'm considering if I can build up a gentle slope on the tank to facilitate a better low point near these pump and low point connections. So that's it. Now, it's regretful that I had to go through all this, but I really feel more for those new to RVs and without the time to get their new and expensive motorhomes remedied. However, I'm confident that Tiffin learned from my circumstances, and they're going to apply this to make it a better product for others. And now, would I buy Tiffin again? Well, when I was looking at the competition and what's out there, I would definitely still keep them on my short list. Would I have bought this motorhome knowing what I'd have to go through to get it right? Probably not. I didn't know what kind of torturous path I was going to go through. But hey, here I am now, and I'm really happy with this motorhome. Now, my next video will be discuss some of the minor issues Tiffin addressed while I was in their service center. but it'll certainly not be as dramatic as this one. So thanks for viewing.